I think everyone's probably here. We may have a few more who are filing in virtually, so to speak, in the coming moments. I want to take a moment to introduce myself, introduce my partner in this endeavor, and welcome you to the course. Hopefully, you know where you are. You're at the part of the summer seminar, The Changing Face of Humanity, where we're going to focus this summer in particular on artificial intelligence and identities of the future. My name is Dr. Andrew Terrell. I'm here with Dr. Eliza Smith. We've done this before. We've had a great time doing it. It's always nice. It's a nice way to begin for those of you who, are joining us. You're going to have a bit of a leg up because it's a sort of low pressure way to have your first course at USD. It's not that your courses will be full of pressure. Otherwise, I hope not. But it's kind of a nice, relaxing over the summer, one credit, pass fail course. The idea is just to introduce you to what it would be, what it will be like for you in another month or two to be in courses what we mean when we talk about a liberal arts education. So bringing lots of different ideas together, connecting all the various things that we study at USD, and a little taste of what it's like to have the kinds of conversations that we expect in a liberal arts setting. And that is, we're not here to just sort of fill your brain with information and have you spew it back out on exams. I hope you don't have many courses like that. We're here to challenge you, to make you think, to make you into better critical thinkers and writers. And this gives you a little taste of what that looks like. And we're trying to model that for you as professors. So I'm from the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Dr. Smith, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Dr. Smith. I'm in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Literatures, and I work in the French section. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
so I think since we started a little bit late, we can maybe introduce the session now. So the overall course is The Changing Face of Humanity, and we'll be focusing specifically on artificial intelligence. But for this week's theme, it's human and non-human consciousness, creation, and thought. So all of our speakers today come from very different disciplines. But as Dr. Terrell mentioned, we want you to sort of think critically about connections and commonalities between all of these talks and the ways in which they sort of complement one another in different ways. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Our first speaker is Professor Vickers. So I'll pass the mic to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am going to try to get my PowerPoint started. So we'll have to see if, oh no, we'll have to see if this works. Let's see if I can share my screen. And okay, so theoretically, can everyone see my slides now? Are we good? All right, awesome. So, hey everyone, I'm excited to be here, and I'm going to talk to you about Plato on what it means to be human and the implications for artificial intelligence. And hopefully you enjoyed the readings today, and we'll talk a little bit about why I picked the particular things that I did. So I am Dr. Darby Vickers. I use she, her pronouns, and that's my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. If I don't email you back in a week, email me again, because I sometimes just get a lot of email and I miss things. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm also now, as of fall 2024, the Elements Chair of the Technology and Humanities at the Humanities Center. Our first event is going to be September 19th, and we have a really cool speaker named Brian Merchant who's going to be talking about his book, Blood in the Machine. I totally suggest you come. It's related to the kind of material that we're going to be talking about in terms of AI. And my research focuses on apprentice learning, cognitive apprenticeship, and virtue ethics. If you don't know what those things mean, that's okay. You're welcome to take some classes with me and find out, or check in with me about that. And my areas of sort of interest in teaching are ancient philosophy, which is where my training is, as well as ethics, epistemology, philosophy of education, and ethics of technology. And I teach classes in all of these various areas. So I'm only teaching upper division classes in the fall, but if you're interested in the future, I teach an intro class in moral psychology, a couple of other things. Feel free to reach out and I can talk to you about what I'm going to be teaching in the next couple of semesters. So I wanted to start off with thinking about what it means to be human, especially in the face of changing technology, and what the implications are for identities of the future. The purpose of the talk today is going to be threefold, or tripartite, because that's going to be the word we're using a lot today. So the first part of this is the content. So I want you to know a little bit about Plato's definition of what it means to be human, which is a being with a tripartite soul. Hopefully you understood what that means from the reading, but if not, we'll talk a little bit about what that means today. And he uses this to create a definition of justice, which is, of course, is important to ethics, which is the field that I primarily teach in. And it also tells us a bunch about what it means for humans to be unique, and particularly what Plato thinks is unique about humanity is that we have the ability to experience intellectual pleasure. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and what the importance of it is today. But it's also something that you get through the humanities in general. So I'm also making a sort of call for us to continue to study the humanities, even in this sort of technology-infused world of the future. The second part of this is that I want to give you a model for sort of how to think through issues and give you a sort of form of cognitive apprenticeship where I'm showing you how philosophers think through things. And particularly one of the things that we do as philosophers is we're really good at extracting theory from non-straightforward texts. And while you might think that this is a sort of skill particular to the humanities where we read a lot of literature and other things, close reading is actually a skill that's useful across all disciplines, not only because it's really important to be able to interpret text in any discipline, even if you're in a field like computer science, white papers and conference proceedings are what pushes the field forward. And those are the kinds of things that get posted and sort of start revolutions in terms of the way that technology develops. But also, close reading is a really useful skill across disciplines because not all texts are written well. And so it's really important for you to be able to extract what an argument is and then reframe it in your own words. And that's part of what we do in philosophical courses. And then the last part of this is a sort of demonstration of why we should care about these kinds of old texts that have been around for 2,400 years. So old philosophical texts actually provide really interesting insights for answering today's burning questions. And I think that Plato provides a sort of better way of looking at what it means to be human than a lot of the contemporary material that's sort of recycling some of the stuff from later periods. And so we'll see if you agree with me by the end of this talk. So Plato proposes that humans are tripartite beings and that we have something called a tripartite soul. This means it's a soul with three parts, tripartite. Humans are distinguished from other creatures by this three-part soul. So animals have either two parts or a one-part soul, and plants have a one-part soul. We can talk about all of those things if you're interested in the discussion section. And each part of the soul for Plato of the human soul houses distinctive desires. And that is what makes that particular part its own distinctive piece. And the three parts that he creates are reason, spirit, which is the sort of seat of the emotions, and then appetite, which is the seat of our sort of bodily desires. Reason is where our intellectual desires are housed, spirit is where our emotional desires are housed, and appetite is where our bodily desires are housed. And each of these types of desires are distinctive and cause us to do different types of things. And Plato thinks it's really important to think through sort of how these are interacting with the kinds of decisions that we make on a regular basis. And particularly fulfilling a desire yields pleasure. So each part of the soul, just like it has a distinctive set of desires, also has a characteristic pleasure when those desires are fulfilled. So when our desires of reason about like problem solving or learning new things are fulfilled, we get intellectual pleasure. When our emotional desires are fulfilled, we get some kind of emotional pleasure like we get from winning a game or victory. When our bodily pleasures are fulfilled or bodily desires are fulfilled, we get bodily pleasure from the experiences of eating or drinking, delicious things, or having a really good night's sleep or something like that. So what is intellectual pleasure? This may not be a thing that you've heard of before this. So as I've said, each part of the soul has its own characteristic pleasure. And so we'll just sort of start off with each of those. So for example, I might have a desire for a really delicious piece of chocolate cake. And when I eat that delicious piece of chocolate cake, I get a kind of aesthetic bodily pleasure from the experience of eating the chocolate cake. And then hopefully I also get some sort of fulfillment from having something in my stomach and being able to use those calories as energy to be able to do the other things that I want to do. So that's what it looks like to have bodily pleasure. Then you might experience when you're playing a video game or when you are sort of engaged in some kind of emotional activity, you get the experience of emotional pleasure from, say, beating your friends at that game or something like that. You can see the sort of expression of pleasure on the kids' faces in this picture, which are presumably, some kind of thing that they have won against others. And then finally, you might have intellectual pleasure from solving some kind of an intellectual problem. So think about when you figured something out. You figured out a difficult math problem, or you figured out how to fix something at your, apartment, or whatever the case may be. You get this sort of hit of intellectual pleasure from that learning, knowing, solving thing that is happening. And this is the sort of idea that we have with intellectual pleasure. And Plato thinks that this is distinctive to humans, and is something that is really important to our ability to be human and to enjoy what it means to have a rational or a reasoning part of our soul. So there's this sort of idea of how is it that we satisfy the soul. So Plato talks about desire satisfaction is going to strengthen the part of the soul that has the desire satisfied. So if I have a particular emotional desire to win a particular game that I've been playing, or I have an emotional desire to sort of like release my emotions by watching a really sad and powerful film, I am strengthening the emotional part of my soul. And Plato thinks that what's really important is that we need to strengthen the reasoning part of our soul, right? Because the reasoning part, according to Plato, keeps the other parts in line. I don't want to be completely led by my emotions so that if my boss yells at me one day, I, yell back, or, terrible, punch the person in the face, right? You don't want to be led by your emotions. Similarly, you don't want to be totally led by your bodily desires and unable to sort of control how much you're eating or drinking or sleeping or any of these sorts of things. So Plato thinks that we need the reasoning part to be the strongest so that we can keep the other parts in check. And for that reason, the kinds of desires we should be preferentially satisfying are those desires of the reasoning part of our soul. And we should satisfy these intellectual desires to strengthen that part. And Plato thinks that the way the sort of model, and you read about this in the reading that I assigned, that he comes up with is a sort of irrigation model. And this occurs in Republic 485d. And he has this idea that if we have a sort of stream of water, right, this sort of stream of pleasure of the things that we're satisfying, if we divert a bunch of that to one field over another, let's say we have sort of 3 different fields that we're watering, we have a particular stream that's coming in, we divert a large portion of that to, say, the reasoning field, then we have less water that we can distribute to the other 2 fields. And his sort of idea is you want to put the most resources, and the most of those resources of pleasure, toward the reasoning part so that we can strengthen this part of our soul and use it to be able to control the other types of desires we have and to be able to use them in the circumstances where they're going to benefit us the most. So looking at this particular passage, I'm sort of reproducing the whole section, but there were 2 particular pieces where I'm gaining this information, and to show you what it looks like to pick out how to extract something from a text are these 2 quotes of Socrates that you see highlighted in yellow here. So Socrates is going to say, when somebody's appetites are strongly inclined in one direction, we surely know that they become more weakly inclined in others, just like a stream that has been partly diverted into another channel. So that's that irrigation metaphor, and thinking about the sort of water and the way that it's being diverted into different pieces. Glaucon says, of course. And then Socrates says, when a person's desire flows toward learning and everything of that sort, they will be concerned, I imagine, with the pleasures that the soul experiences just by itself, and will be indifferent to those that come through the body, if indeed a person is not counterfeit, but rather a true philosopher. So the idea here is that the kinds of people that are interested primarily in preferentially satisfying the reasoning part of the soul are the philosophers. Plato, of course, is going to think that that makes them equipped to rule. And you may or may not think that after taking your philosophy classes. But the sort of idea here is that you want to make sure that you're not being sort of a slave to your appetites and sort of constantly seeking kinds of bodily pleasures or emotional pleasures, but rather have the ability to regulate yourself with the reasoning sort of powers. And you do that by having really strong intellectual desires and strengthening them by continually satisfying them in preference to the desires of the other parts of the soul. So Plato's theory of pleasure is this liquid metaphor that we've talked about already. And the reason that he thinks that liquid is a good metaphor is that there are these sort of properties of a liquid, right? You can pour it into something, you can fill it up, it takes the shape of the container. And it's something that is also used, right? Like water is a really important liquid that allows other things to grow. It has these sort of like incredible powers to it. And this is what he thinks that pleasure is doing, right? We need pleasure in order to keep ourselves going. If we're ascetics, it's really hard for us to get anything done because we're constantly denying ourselves that pleasure. But he thinks it needs to be channeled into the right place, just like you can channel water or other types of liquid into the ways that you want it. And he uses examples of this not only in the Republic, but in another dialogue called the Gorgias, which, if you're interested, we read in the ancient philosophy course that I teach. And he has this metaphor in the Gorgias of a sort of leaky jar, right? So somebody that's constantly chasing bodily pleasure is like somebody who's like seeking sort of drugs or, is sort of addicted to like foods or drinks or whatever, constantly has to refill their jar as though there's a leak in the bottom. So they're constantly seeking to refill it with those pleasures. Whereas somebody who has a sort of soul that is much more adapted to being able to sort of enjoy the continual fulfillment of those desires of intellectual pleasure is going to be like a jar that doesn't leak, or like a stream that's flowing into one particular field and strengthening the sort of plants within that field is the metaphor that he's using here. So we get the stream in Republic 485D, as I've mentioned. It nourishes the part of the soul based on which the desires are satisfied, and the more desire satisfaction, the stronger the soul part is. So this is not just in terms of appetitive pleasures. We often think of pleasure as being specifically bodily pleasures, but rather they're these sort of characteristic pleasures that you've already seen, and preferentially satisfying those will educate our souls in the proper way. So if you're really interested in the intellectual pleasure that you get out of the classes that you take, whether it be your classes in science or art or anything like that, all of those are the kinds of things that will allow you to be a good person in the way that Plato is thinking about it. So Plato thinks that intellectual pleasure is unique to humans because we are the ones that have a reasoning part of our soul that can have this characteristic pleasure. And intellectual pleasure is characteristic of the rational part of our soul, and only humans among living creatures have a rational part of the soul, at least according to this view, although we might think that there are some intellectual capacities for various types of animals, particularly non-human primates. And it's this pleasure of the soul itself in itself, right? So the idea is that it doesn't require you to have a whole bunch of material possessions or require you to have particular experiences, but rather even in your own mind, just sort of solving problems that you come up with, you can get these pleasures of the intellectual desire to try to know and solve and figure out more things. And there's a comparison to another philosopher named John Stuart Mill. So Mill also thinks that intellectual pleasure is really important, and he thinks that pleasures can be qualitatively different. And so intellectual pleasures are sort of qualitatively better rather than just sort of having as many pleasures as possible, which would be quantitatively better. And Plato in the Republic is also going to make this claim, right? You saw this really absurd claim in the end of the reading that I gave you, where he has this idea that we have a qualitatively better life, which becomes a quantitatively sort of better thing. And so he makes this crazy claim that the philosopher who is constantly satisfying his intellectual pleasure or her intellectual pleasure is 729 times happier than the tyrant who is constantly satisfying bodily pleasures and has something that approaches much more that leaky jar that gets described in the Gorgias. So what does this mean for thinking about something like ethics, right? So there's this intersection between pleasure and character, and Plato thinks that pleasures are particularly important for shaping our character. And so the question is, so how do these characteristic pleasures shape personality? And what are the three different types of people that are sort of mentioned in this passage, right? So he's going to give us these sort of three particular people. He talks about the philosopher, who are the ones that are interested in intellectual pleasure, the lovers of sights and sounds, that are the people that are interested in the emotional pleasures, right? So people who love going to see plays and things like that. And then finally, the like tyrant who's interested primarily in bodily pleasure. And he's going to say that this is going to tell us something very specific about the arrangement of their souls. And so he'll say that the ruling part of the soul, whatever part you have strengthened the most by fulfilling those particular desires, characteristic of that part, are going to shape our personality and determine the appropriate function of the individual in society. So the philosopher is the one that's ruled by reason, the lover of sights and sound is the one that's ruled by emotion, and the tyrant is going to be the one that is ruled by bodily pleasure. And so Plato has this sort of bizarre idea in this ideal city that he's created in the Republic, and that ideal city is called the Callipolis, and that sort of kalos root, it means beautiful, and polis is the word for like city or city-state, right? So the idea is that it's the perfect city, and that's that name, Callipolis, that he's using. And he says that in the Callipolis, which is the sort of ideally arranged state, we have philosophers as kings. They're the sort of rulers or guardians. They're the teachers of the next group of guardians. They're the administrative function and the executive function of the tasks of the city. So they serve as judges, they serve as lawmakers, and they serve in sort of all of these very important administrative roles. They get educated until they're 50 years old. Can you imagine going to school until you're 50? Well, that's kind of what being a professor is like. But there's this, and they're not allowed to have any personal wealth, right? So they're not supposed to be sort of trained to have any particular desires beyond the sort of interest in those intellectual pleasures, teaching others, and just exploring their own intellectual world. Then we have the auxiliaries, who are the soldiers and the law keepers, and they are athletes, they're soldiers, they're peacekeepers within the city, they enforce the laws, and they have a long education, although it's not nearly as long as the philosophers, and they too have no personal wealth, right? They are supposed to be interested in honor and victory, and both sort of over any kind of enemies of the city from the outside, but also the sort of honor of keeping the peace within the city itself and making sure that everything functions in the way that it's supposed to, as peacekeepers within the city. And then finally, he thinks that the last group of people who are interested primarily in the bodily pleasures and are ruled by the appetitive part of their soul are producers, right? We still need these people within this the city, and particularly they are the people that produce food and textiles, technology, weapons, all of these sorts of things. There's sort of less of a focus on education for these people, and there is a system of personal wealth because that's something that gets used as incentives for these particular individuals. Now, we may not think this is an ideal world, even though it's supposed to be a meritocratic system. It's kind of frightening to have these kinds of classes that are so rigid that we might see in Plato. But what the idea here that's really interesting is that he's basically saying that there are certain types of personalities that are useful for particular types of roles within a city. And there are certain types of incentives that can be used to get people to play those roles based on the kinds of pleasures and the kinds of desires that they are most interested in. And that's something that we can sort of take away and think through as being useful, even if we want to abandon the sort of classist notions that show up in the Republic. So for Plato, what justice looks like, justice is a really important aspect of humanity. It looks like the city sort of behaving in the way that it's supposed to, and it's each part of the city doing its own tasks and not interfering with the tasks of others. But it's also each sort of part of the soul doing its own task and not interfering with the tasks of the others. So we get justice in the soul, which means that the rational part is in charge and the other parts follow their respective duties. The spirited part is supposed to protect us, and the appetitive part keeps our body alive and functioning. And then justice in the city is going to look the same, except in terms of the classes. So how is this relevant to artificial intelligence? Well, for Plato, humans are the only beings that we know of that have tripartite souls, although there's a possibility that aliens or angels or various other things might have tripartite souls as well. Non-human animals, not so far as we know, are going to have a full rational part of the soul, but there's a possibility depending upon what we might discover about them in the future. And he has this idea that gods and potentially angels, depending upon how they get framed, differ because they're purely rational beings rather than having bodily pleasures, and rather than being able to experience these things. And we might think that artificial general intelligence, which is something that people are aiming at, or some kind of artificial super intelligence, would also be purely rational because it doesn't have a body and have the ability to have bodily pleasures, as well as not necessarily being able to have emotions. Although for any of you who have read Turing's paper, there's some interesting sort of questions about him thinking that potentially an AGI would have to have emotions. So then what does this mean, right? There's this idea that justice and intellectual pleasure are unique features of humanity that separate us from AGI, even the sort of most advanced AI that we could imagine. There are these sort of two things. There's a philosophical upshot in terms of ethics, and then there's a philosophical upshot in terms of epistemology or ontology or things like that. So the first one is that in terms of justice, while AI can do good deeds and do them for rational reasons, justice requires not just rationality, but also mercy, empathy, and compassion, which come from the spirited part of our soul. Sort of algorithmic fairness and ways of determining whether algorithms are unfair or biased might be possible, but algorithmic justice is not, because we need that ability for compassion and mercy that comes from the ability to have emotions. And then on top of that, we learn this sort of thing about what humanity is. Intellectual pleasure is a type of pleasure that's unique to humans and is the sort of peak of our humanity. A liberal arts education, which is what all of you are about to endeavor on, trains you to be able to understand, appreciate, and gain pleasure from the products of human labor, whether that's from science, whether that's from art, whether that's from literature, plays, any of these kinds of things, philosophy. This is what's sort of training you to be the most human that you can be. And that's one of the reasons why you're hopefully here, to get a liberal arts education. And even if we gave AI a liberal arts education without the ability to experience pleasure in that intellectual material, it would lack an essential component of humanity, which is why sort of humans continue to be important, even if we can get AI to do a lot of tasks better than we can. So feel free to chat with me about any questions you might have. I'm going to be leading the discussion section on Thursday, so please come in and bring your questions. And I think I took a little bit too long, but sorry about that for the rest of the presenters. And I'm excited to have you all here.
Thank you so much, Professor Vickers. Before we move on to our next presenter, Naomi had a little question in the chat about the Q&A. If you guys want to add questions as we go along, if you just want to note them down, or even if you have comments, at the very end of this session, in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll open it up to a wider discussion, so you all have a chance to chime in, whether that's through chat or if you want to raise your hand. So just to let you all know. So we're going to move right along with our next speaker, Professor Lovett-Coiler.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I want to start by thanking my colleague, Dr. Vickers, for a wonderful presentation. It's really nice to be with you all. Just give me a second while I pull up my presentation. I'm not as organized as Dr. Vickers. Great. Well, so as Dr. Smith said, my name is Michael Lovett-Collier. I serve at the University of San Diego as the Vice President for Mission Integration, so primarily in an administrative role, but I'm also delighted each semester to be able to teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. This fall semester, I'll be teaching as a part of the Advocate LLC, teaching a class THRS 114, which is Introduction to Catholic Studies. I hope some of you might be in that course. I'm really excited to be with you today and to have this time together, but even more excited to welcome you to campus on August, to get to know you and to welcome you into the USD community. So that's a little bit about me, but now a little bit perhaps about theology. Theology is one of the many disciplines that we offer at USD. And discipline's a funny word because for most of us, when we hear the word discipline, we think about the Marine Corps, or we think about athletes like those that will be competing in the Olympics later this month. And we think about that because discipline for us usually connotes things like motivation, self-control, focus, the ability to wake up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym 6 days a week or something like that. And that is one definition of the word discipline. However, there's another definition which refers to an area of study or instruction or knowledge. So a discipline is a lot like a subject. In high school, when I was in high school a long time ago, we used to talk about different subjects. So math was a subject, social studies, history, science, literature, those kind of things. So when we talk about theology, that's a discipline. Dr. Vickers is from the discipline of philosophy. Dr. Hasselbeck, who will come next, is from English, and so on and so forth. So theology, what is this discipline all about? A lot of times a great way to understand what a word is about, as you know, perhaps from the SAT preparation you might have done, which is to think about the etymology or the background of the word. So the word theology, if you think about the etymology of the word, you might recognize the first bit is theo, and then the last part is ology. And theo, some of you probably know, refers to God, and ology is the study of. So theology can simply be defined as the study of God. The second part of the word, though, that etymology also has a meaning of talk or language or word. So theology can also be understood as God talk. So then we can think about all the different disciplines that are offered at a place like USD as referring to different kinds of discourse or talk. So one of my favorite images of a university is a really vibrant, exciting party, like this kind of a scene, where there are different groups of people having different kinds of conversations. So we might think about those people in the lower right-hand corner where there's a woman kind of running her hand through her hair, maybe. Maybe those are the philosophers who are having conversations about things like Plato and Socrates and intellectual pleasure and all the things, wonderful things that Dr. Vickers just mentioned. We might think about those people in the lower left picture here who maybe are eating a cupcake or something as the theologians who are having talks, who are having conversation about God and about the divine and what that means for their life and ethics and morality because of their belief in God. And we can think about all the different people. Maybe there's biologists who are having conversations about life, sociologists having conversations about society, whatever it might be. So that's what we mean by disciplines, and that's what we mean by theology. So with that said, I'm going to do something really kind of dangerous and try to share. Well, I won't do that because I want to be cognizant of time. But some of you might remember that back in November of 2021, there was a wonderful and catchy song released by an artist named Celine Elise. And her song was called Hey Siri, What's the Meaning of Life? I hope some of you maybe are familiar with it. Basically, it goes through this wonderful haunting voice of Celine talking to Siri saying, could you teach me how to make an apple pie? Could you teach me how to say thank you in Japanese? And then after listing some other kinds of questions like that, what we might think of as very practical, concrete, or technical questions, she asked Siri, what's the meaning of life? Now that song, you remember, was released in November of 2021. That was a kind of a singular moment in history. We were still very much finding our way from the season of isolation caused by the pandemic to a new normal where we're reconnected with people. And during the pandemic, so many of us, myself included, and I imagine many of you, spent a lot of time on devices, looking at screens, interacting with Siri or Google. And so it's interesting to think about the ways in which our questions were shaped by that experience, by spending so much time with our devices. And yet, the ways in which some questions are enduring and perhaps took on even greater urgency. In the midst of a global pandemic, what is the meaning of life? While it can be helpful to know how to make an apple pie or how to say thank you in Japanese or any other language, the greatest questions that we have, the most profound questions and the most urgent questions are things like, what is the meaning of life? ChatGPT or other forms of artificial intelligence can write an essay for us. If we asked it to write an essay about the meaning of life, for example, it could. In fact, I put the prompt to ChatGPT and said, what is the meaning of life? Here's what it told me. The meaning of life is to find fulfillment and purpose in our existence, whether through personal growth, meaningful relationships, contribution to society, or spiritual exploration. Notice, if you will, that that's not really an answer to the question. It's a general description of the question and a list of options that might need to be prioritized or focused to come up with a personalized answer to the question. I don't know how many of you have spent time using ChatGPT, but if you have, you know that it's capable of doing some really clever and interesting things. And one of those things it can do is adopt different personas or personalities. So to pursue this line of thought a little further, I asked it to assume the persona of Taylor Swift and to answer the question, what is the meaning of life, by incorporating song lyrics. And so here's what it told me. The meaning of life is to live in the moments when you're happy, free, confused at the same time. Embracing love because you're the best thing that's ever been mine. Learning from experience, as I once believed love would be burning red, but it's golden like daylight. Overcoming challenges with resilience because I shake it off. And finding joy in everyday moments, knowing that everything will be all right if I keep you next to me. When I shared this definition with my 12-year-old daughter, she said, huh, why are there two references to 22, but none to, the fearless era? I guess that's the best era. Anyways, again, if you notice, this definition isn't really a definition. It's a general description of the question and a list of options. For example, it doesn't really tell us, even if we take it seriously, which we don't want to take it too seriously, but even if we take this seriously, how we might go about finding joy in everyday moments, or which everyday moments we ought to be paying attention to find joy in. Now, here's the really important point that we should take seriously. Even if we don't ask ChatGPT or other AI models to assume the persona of somebody else, they are always telling us answers in somebody else's words. So it's fundamentally incapable of answering the question that Celine Elise asked back in 2021, or that you might ask, and that I hope you will ask, or that I might ask. What is the meaning of my life? AI can tell us in general what other people have said about that question, but they can't tell us what we say about that question. The challenge of AI expands the challenge that we've already been living with the advent of the internet and the smartphone and other forms of technology. That challenge is that they provide us with a constant and immensely appealing, in fact, addictive supply of what others have said. And because we're constantly accessing what other people have said, it becomes harder and harder to listen to what we have to say, to hear our deep longings, and to discern what we think. This is one of the reasons why I love the article that I assigned for this session, which is Baseball is a Road to God. The author, John Sexton, suggests that baseball can slow us down, helping us to develop the capacity for contemplation, sensitivity, awareness, and mystical intensity. This is why he suggests that baseball can be a road to God. Now, I know not everybody is a baseball fan. And even if you're not, I hope you were able to discern or to glean some important insights that I think Sexton makes. So, for example, in just a few paragraphs, he beautifully articulates a concept that is at the very heart of Catholic liberal arts education offered by schools like USD. And that concept is the compatibility of faith and reason. Sexton does a really compelling job, I think, of articulating the ways in which faith and reason complement one another. They go together rather than contradicting each other. He quotes the scientist Stephen Jay Gould, who describes faith and reason as non-overlapping magisterial. So in other words, two distinct sources of knowledge and insight. And we can devote ourselves to both, benefiting from the unique perspectives that each has to offer. Sexton suggests that we live in an age of science. If that was the case 11 years ago when his book was published, it is certainly even more the case now. We might say that we're no longer just in the age of science, but science and technology. And as Sexton hints, this can lead us to scientism, science as an implicit religion, where we see science as the supreme deity that will provide an answer to all of our questions, that perhaps is the answer to all of our questions. In contrast to scientism, Sexton wants to suggest that no matter how advanced our science is or becomes, no matter how powerful our AI models become, there are always going to be dimensions of our lives that are unknowable, or in the word that he focuses on, ineffable, no matter how hard we try to figure them out. That word, ineffable, is one that I hope that you'll take with you from our time together today. Ineffable simply means that which cannot be fully described by words, although music, poetry, and art sometimes comes close. Sexton gives the example for ineffable of love, when he says that he knows his wife loves him. And that's a great example. I agree. I often tell my wife and my daughter I love them, and it doesn't come close to fully capturing the emotion and the reality that I experience. However, those words are as close as they get, and yet they don't fully capture it. Sexton doesn't come right out and say it, but he certainly believes that God is ineffable. So that brings us to the transition I want to make, which is to our images of God. Most of us have a pediatric, a childlike image of God. And that's for good reason. It's because most of us stop learning about God or stop engaging in any sort of formal religious education when we're in middle school or in high school. And this creates the challenge that when we face adult problems, when we face all the complexities and challenges of adult life, often we are drawing upon a religious imagination of an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old. This unfortunately has the effect that many people decide that religion or faith has nothing to offer, when the challenge and the truth of the situation might be that an adult conception of faith might actually have a lot more to offer. You might notice the image on this slide is from the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's famous depiction of God creating Adam. Notice there that the God is on the right, of course, with the beard reaching down. I like this slide because it helps us pay attention to the fact that the way in which God has been depicted often leads us to imagine that God is somewhat like Santa Claus. That's that pediatric sense of faith. Many of us have a sense that God is a distant judge, watching us whether we're asleep or awake, knowing if we've been good or bad. So it'll be good for goodness sake. So God is a distant judge, rewarding or punishing based on our behavior. That's one way to think about and imagine and relate to God. And many people have done that over the course of thousands of years. Sexton, in his book, though, suggests there are many other ways to imagine, think about, and relate to God. And he draws upon the work of the great Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, who suggested that the best way to think about God is the depth and ground of all being. The depth and ground of all being. If you just think about that for a moment, it's so different from the idea of God as Santa Claus. While Tillich lived back in the mid-1900s, there are various contemporary theologians and authors who continue to explore what we might call alternative ways of imagining God, non-Santa Claus images of God. And in theology classes at USD, you'll have a chance to engage with some of these theologians and to identify what the strengths and the weaknesses are of their arguments. One of the writers who engages in this sort of work is one of my favorites. His name's Father Greg Boyle. He's a Jesuit priest who worked with former gang members in East Los Angeles. One of Boyle's most important claims is that our image of God is profoundly consequential. Well, many of us probably go through life thinking that it doesn't really matter if we think about God as Santa Claus or as the depth and ground of all being. Boyle puts that to the test and says, no, it really does matter. It has profound implications. And our image of God has implications for how we feel about ourselves, how we relate to others, how we show up in the world, and certainly how we answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Boyle goes on to argue that many of us have settled for a too tiny, a puny image of God, one that is really created in our image, a projection of our own desires, rather than being open to having our own categories expanded and illuminated. In the Catholic Christian tradition, you might know that there's a traditional understanding of God as Trinity. So it's a little bit similar to what Dr. Vickers was talking about with tripartite, Trinity meaning three. So we think about God as Father, Son, and Spirit. This is the foundational image of God in the Christian tradition. And again, so if we think about God as a Trinity, it shifts our understanding of God, not so much as the bearded monarch or the distant judge, but instead, and this is really important and really powerful, imagining God as a Trinity helps us see God as a relationship, a community of self-giving love. So rather than the distant judge in the sky, we see God as, to use the words of St. Augustine, lover, beloved, lover, and the love that exists between them. So rather than imagining God as that distant monarch, we could see this image as an appropriate image of God. Neither the Father or the daughter is God, but the image of the beloved, the lover, and the love that exists between them is an image of God. This makes good sense besides being sort of interesting. If you think about the best times in your life, perhaps the moments where you felt most joyful, most fully alive, like you were having the most fun. I'm willing to bet that during those moments, you were surrounded and connected to people. You were in relationship you were in community with people that loved you and that you love. And on the flip side, we think about the hardest moments of our lives, the times that were most challenging, that felt dark, that we're really struggling. It was almost always when we're isolated, when we're cut off from relationship and communities. This is, in fact, what made the pandemic so challenging, is during a moment when we most needed the support and the love of other people, we needed to be separate, which made that experience even more difficult. So the point being here is that God can be imagined as Santa Claus or a distant judge, or God can be imagined as a relationship, a community of self-giving love. So in conclusion, I wanted to draw you attention to this wonderful image, which is sometimes just called the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. The idea being here is that we are constantly surrounded by data. If you are in a space, and you are because you're listening to me online, with an internet connection, you are literally surrounded by data. That data can be combined and integrated to become information and even knowledge. However, wisdom is distinctively human. Wisdom can only come from the human, making sense of all the knowledge, information, and data that leads up to it. In this age of science that we find ourselves in, or this age of science and technology, almost all of us are walking around with a supercomputer in our pocket. Rarely do we go even a few moments without checking our phone, receiving vast quantities of information in the form of texts and messages and photos and alerts. The capabilities of our phones and now AI models like ChatGPT are impressive, and they appear limitless. And while impressive, and while it would always be good to have more and easy access to information and knowledge, the information they provide is technical, directed primarily to our heads. To be sure, that kind of information is useful. It can be useful to know how to bake an apple pie or to say thank you in Japanese. Yet, education of the heart is just as important. In fact, like Sexton, I would argue that the most critical aspects of our lives are related to our heart and are ineffable. They cannot be reduced to words, so they cannot be entered into a ChatGPT model, and it can't be produced by an AI model. This is why a Catholic liberal arts education is so valuable and such a gift, and I'm so excited that you'll be beginning your journey with us in about a month. The kind of education that USD offers focuses on the head and the heart. And finally, I just wanted to conclude with one idea. You've heard me say, and you've heard Dr. Vickers say already, a little bit about the liberal arts. And you'll learn more about that. But there's a wonderful way of sort of tweaking the word liberal arts to think about it as the liberating arts. So studying philosophy, theology, English, or the other disciplines in the humanities can liberate you to become your most authentic self, to become the person that you were created to be. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be a part of the USD community and to welcome you into it in August. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lovett Collier. I love that liberating arts. Be free, everybody. Liberate yourselves. Okay, our third presenter today, Professor Hasselback.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Lovett Collier. Thank you, Dr. Vickers. Those were so fascinating. I wish I could take your philosophy and theology courses. I love the liberating arts idea so much. I'm so excited for you students. You get to do all of this. I wish I could. Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Hasselback. I teach in the English department. I am also the director of the Writing Center, which is a resource that I really hope you will use during your time at USD. We're located in the Learning Commons, and it's peer-to-peer tutoring sessions for any kind of paper project. Relevant to today's topic, we do not work on any work that has used AI at all. So if you use AI, whether or not it's, allowed by your professor, some professors allow it, we do not work on those assignments. That is your Writing Center consultant if you use that. So, but do please come see us. It's a collection of wonderful, useful, kind, patient peers who would love to help you with your work. So, and I also just want to say before anything else, just welcome to USD. We're so happy you're here. We're so excited to meet you. I love seeing your faces today. I was getting into a summer funk and it's been really exhilarating to see some students again. And I look forward to meeting you and kind of journeying along with you during the next 4 years of your academic adventure. So I will attempt to share my screen. I'm bad at this now. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Aha. Desktop. Hmm. Let me see if can I pull it up like this? Can you all see that? It's clumsy right now. Okay, I'll put it in. Hold on, how do I present? Just a sec. Okay. Okay. So my talk today is a bit farther afield from the topic of AI specifically, and instead I'm focusing on technology and just scientific advancement in a more general sense. It's my hope that we can use the lens of Frankenstein, the novel. Many of you might be familiar with it, many of you might not. That's totally fine, but to understand how to grapple with technological advancement as we are confronted by it. And I titled my talk Frankenstein and Self-Discovery because I think this novel is often misread as a criticism of technology rather than as a warning to think critically, something we get with a liberal arts education, critical thinking skills, right? We need to think critically about new developments of every kind in order to confront them in a responsible, ethical, moral way, right? So I think I have a twofold job today. The first is to model some close textual readings that make a case for this novel as more about the treatment of others than about a kind of anti-technological sentiment. And the second is to expose you to the kinds of questions and practices that we engage in the field of literary inquiry and English. So I will advance here. We will come back to this quote later. So just a bit about English literature. Sorry, I have to kind of collapse this so I can see my slides here. 1 sec. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay. So before diving into the novel, I'll just outline some brief details about what we do in the English department. Here, what do studies in literature afford? So studying literature hones your skills in sensitive reading, critical thinking, and persuasive writing. You need these skills for everything you will do in your life to be better at them, to be better skilled at them. These are very, very useful for you. Politics, religion, and philosophy live in language and discourse. And you need to know how to manipulate that language. Reading stories told from diverse perspectives can help us to understand the varied voices and constitute, sorry, 1 sec. And experiences that constitute our community and our world. Literature offers a space to engage with and explain the world as well as your place in it. And for fulfillment, right? For this kind of pleasure that Dr. Vickers was talking about. A literary scholar aims to be a holistic person, versed in many facets of knowledge. We read, write, analyze, and discuss because we find pleasure and utility in these endeavors. And so English as an academic discipline, the field of literary studies relies on the idea that narratives reflect our world as well as our understanding of it. These narratives can inspire us to shape, constantly question, and act on that understanding. And I really wanted to emphasize this idea of acting on, because reading isn't just about reading and then putting that book down and going about your life, right? It's about being challenged and changed by what you read and acting upon what you learn. So, okay, sorry. There we go. Okay. So why did I pick Frankenstein? I would love to know, maybe in the chat or by a show of little Zoom hands, how many people have read it before. I'd love to, I'll just kind of change my what I can see. So, okay, some people, some professors have read. Okay, so maybe some of you, that's great. Honestly, I'm hoping to kind of plug it today as a novel. It has everything. It has something for everyone, right? So I'll talk more about the genre a bit too, but if you're looking for a really, exciting summer read, this maybe is one for you. So I know you've read a bit about the novel in the reading that I posted, but I wanted to just give some explanation about why I chose this novel today and what it has to do with AI and technology more generally. So this was written in around 1816. It was published in 1818 in its first form. It's a novel about an ambitious doctor who is named Dr. Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein. The creature is a different figure. He brings a creature into life in an incredible feat of scientific and technological advancement. He then freaks out. He is unwilling or unable to face the effect of his labors, and he abandons his creation. We will read a segment where he does that. And then after that abandonment, the creature wreaks havoc on everybody's lives. The novel is often seen as a metaphor for the potential dangers of technological overreach. That is a maybe surface level reading of the novel. Don't do that. Don't try to do things and then bad things won't happen. But I think closer readings help us see, including readings of Victor's cruel neglect and the creature's drive toward empathy, that Shelley's tale cautions against human mistreatment rather than against technological use or misuse. So the connection I'm trying to draw here is English literature, a discipline about critical thinking. Frankenstein is a novel about critical thinking, and it models that kind of critical thinking that we're supposed to be doing. It forces readers to think about the obligations of creators, and it trains them to anticipate the ethical and moral questions that go along with acts of creation and technological use. So together we will read a scene of Victor's neglect and a scene of the creature's drive toward empathy through his engagement with reading. So let's just dive in. Okay. So generically speaking, as I was saying before, Frankenstein's got it all. So it participates in multiple genres. It's a romantic novel. So romantic novels are known for their focus on nature, emotion, imagination, spontaneity, art, beauty, aesthetics, sensory experience, the supernatural themes of solitude, which was interesting. I was thinking about Dr. Livette Collier's presentation and those moments of kind of intense loneliness that people experience, those despairing moments. It is a Gothic novel, which is a subgenre of the romance novels, involving mystery and suspense, omens, visions, supernatural, inexplicable events, intense emotionality. And finally, it's seen by many as the first English language science fiction novel. So there are non-human characters, there is allegory, journeying, interaction between humanity and technology at this really basic level. Okay, so let's dive into the title page. This is the 1818 original title page, and it's the first time Shelley really kind of primes her readers to think about things in deeper, more critical, philosophical, and associative ways. So if you notice here, I've kind of glossed over and rewritten the quote from Milton's Paradise Lost, but it says, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" So already we're thinking associatively, we're thinking, okay, what does this have to do with the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? How is he aligning himself with Adam here? That is Adam speaking. And so what are those associations? It's also subtitled, it's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So we're recalling the Greek myth here too. So already this is a text that is on its very title page, rich in intertextuality. And we're supposed to be kind of creating metaphors and associations all on our own. It's priming us to think about, think critically about what's happening and treatment and so many things. So just here's a bit about Prometheus. So in classical legend, Prometheus was credited with creating man from clay. So there's this kind of creation metaphor, coming through in many ways. Mary Shelley's creating the novel. There is God creating Adam and Eve. Prometheus creating man from clay, and then Victor Frankenstein creating the creature. So Prometheus stole fire from heaven to benefit mankind. For this, he was punished by the gods. His punishment was horrifically cruel. He was bound to a rock. Each day, an eagle eats his liver, which regenerates in time to be eaten again the following day. And so we're asking already, what are the metaphors in this novel? Who creates whom? Who is stealing what? What's the significance of the punishment? And we're getting a lot of really interesting existential questions. So here we get, what is man? What is identity? What isn't identity, right? What is the role of language in shaping, conveying, and rendering identity? How might one delimit the self? And how are those boundaries generative of identity? So we have that set. We have, also she poses more specific questions about sympathy and treatment as they relate to the broader, more existential questions. So here, what separates man from clay? How is identity related to individualization, autonomy, or promotion? What, if anything, is the obligation of the creator to the created? This is really important for us as we think about technology. What's at stake on both sides in the molding of man, the shaping of something new, right? Um, Okay, so let's dive into the text, but already we're kind of like swimming with ideas about what we're supposed to be thinking about and kind of sorting through as we start this text. So this is early on in the novel. It's volume 1, chapter 4. We inhabit the voice of Victor Frankenstein. It's an epistolary novel, so we go through different perspective, a novel in letters. So right now, this is Victor Frankenstein's voice, and this is from volume 1. He has just successfully animated the creature. So I will read this, bear with me. If this were class, I would ask for a volunteer or a few very unhappy volunteers, but I'm on my own here, so bear with me. I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotion at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endued with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived. Okay, so I'm the one who did the underlining and the emboldening of these sections here. These are just parts that I wanted to kind of point out to you. So some takeaways from this. Victor hates him in part because he's ugly. And Victor chose I don't know if you know this, but he went to a charnel house, which is where they dumped the body parts of very poor people. He picked out body parts, and that's how he created this creature. He kind of sewed them together, animated them with lightning. You have to suspend disbelief. It all worked out, so he came to being. But he's ugly. That is so cruel, right? That he hates this being because he's ugly, right? So number one, some first takeaway. The name calling, it's brutal, right? Wretch, miserable monster, demoniacal corpse, a thing whom I had, so a demoniacal corpse and a thing. He doesn't even give him the humanity of a gendered pronoun, right? He's an it, right? So not even giving him that. Shelley is keen to include the phrase here, whom I had created. I underlined that just to highlight it, almost as a reminder that Victor is responsible for him, a parent of sorts. And I want to go back to this parent reading. In the emboldened section here, he's like a newborn. He's like a baby, right? He gazes at him. Victor sees this as his eyes being fixed on him, right? In this sinister way. This could be like a baby looking at their parent, right? His jaws opened. He muttered some inarticulate sounds. He's like babbling like a baby, right? He's smiling. A grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken. He did not hear. He did not hear his being, right? This creature that he created. And I think this is the most devastating part. He reaches out to him, seemingly to detain him, right? But he's just reaching out and he escapes. right? So I think there's some work here to generate sympathy for this creature and to read critically what Victor is saying. Even though we're inhabiting his perspective, we're supposed to be thinking like, oh, there's something seems maybe a little bit off here. He gazes at him, he reaches out to him, smiles at him, only to be shunned and abandoned. So the first excerpt here establishes sympathy for the creature, but you have to read somewhat critically for that because it is easy to get kind of wrapped up in the drama of it all and the fear and the terror, right? So then let's go to the second excerpt. This is much, much later in the novel. It's volume 2. We are now inhabiting the perspective of the creature himself, who has learned to, well, he's already learned to read. He's narrating the moment when he kind of learns to read and finds books. So this comes way later. We're switched into his viewpoint. He's raised himself completely alone by now. So the creature finds 3 books. One of which, interestingly, is John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, which is excerpted on the title page. And there's a switch in epistolary perspective here. So he writes, such was the history of my beloved cottagers. It impressed me deeply. I learned from the views of social life which it developed to admire their virtues and to deprecate the vices of mankind. As yet, I looked upon crime as a distant evil. Benevolence and generosity were ever present before me, inciting within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene where so many admirable qualities were called forth and displayed. I found on the ground a leathern portmanteau containing several articles of dress and some books. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, these books were written in the language, the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories. I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. So from this, we learn a few things from the creature. He strives to model the goodness of the cottagers that he observes. We also learn that reading helps him to gain empathy. Interestingly, the empathy is for himself. He's like a kind of a character that he's learning and studying, right? We learn a bit more from this. I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. So reading here for him enables self-articulation and identity formation. Here's another quote, increase of knowledge only discovered to me more clearly what a wretched outcast I was. I cherished hope, it is true, but it vanished. When I beheld the person reflected in water or my shadow in the moonshine, even as that frail image and that inconstant shade. And then reading leads to knowledge of loneliness, longing for companionship, and the first stirrings of his immoral behavior. Before this, he was good, right? He was a good, I'm going to say person. But it was all a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows or shared my thoughts. I was alone. I remembered Adam's supplication to his creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. So he's learning about himself, his condition, the conditions of others. This is what reading helps us do. That devastating loneliness that Dr. Livette Collier talked about. He's feeling the stirrings of injustice, which lead to his engagement with immorality. I cursed him, right? He's bitter now, the bitterness of his heart. And I'm thinking back to Dr. Vickers' presentation when she talked about mercy, empathy, and compassion. These are now kind of, he's got some fluency with these. He's learning how to be himself and how to be. So some general takeaways from these 2 excerpts and then just the progression of the novel in a more general sense. The creature, a creation of both Victor Frankenstein and Mary Shelley herself, who referred to this in an early preface as her hideous progeny. The novel is her progeny. Explicitly reads and discusses Milton's Paradise Lost, a poem about the fall of man. So there's this layering of creation as it applies to writer, to scientist, to creature, and that asks readers to question who in Frankenstein is actually fallen. The shifts in perspective in that it's an epistolary novel, which echoes Milton's engagement with characters spanning heaven, hell, earth, all, the whole gamut. Reinstate the novel's initial questions, those broadly existential ones and the specifically behavioral ones about identity. And finally, the generation of sympathy in the novel, which echoes Satan's interiority in Paradise Lost, suggests that we readers, take on this directive as well. Not just to read or learn, but like the creature, to treasure these abilities. Remember, what did he say? He said they were prizes and treasures. They gave him extreme delight, right? If only my students talked about books this way. Again, not just think, but like Milton, to inhabit uncomfortable realms of thought. What does it mean to ventriloquize Satan and make him kind of persuasive, right? To not just reflect, but like Mary Shelley herself, to embrace the fruits of contemplation, even when the emotional and intellectual outcome promises chaos. And then finally, as this relates to you, to not just learn, but as the promising young scholars that you are, to act, right? This is going back to that sense of action that we have. And this is what we can apply to questions relating to technology and its development as well. We must treasure our ability to learn and grow, our humanity perhaps, right? Sit in uncomfortable places with it. Let your thinking take you further, right? And let your thinking take you not just further, but to action as well. And so when this novel is discussed in the classroom or just generally as you're reading it, often the question comes up, what is the actual monster? Who's the monster? Who's monstrous here? It ends up being way more complicated than you think. It's not that creature that was stitched together. It may be, but maybe there's more to it than that, right? So if you come to my discussion sections on Wednesday, I would love to hear what you think the monster is or was in this case. And then as it relates to technological developments that we confront, what those might be and how we can avoid those. What is it? What is the monster? What is monstrous, right? And I want to return now to the quote I included earlier. So before here, so this is not an anti-technology novel, I'm hoping I showed, but one that inspires readers to think critically about the implications of technological and scientific developments, to ask sometimes uncomfortable questions about the obligations that are created around technology, and to develop responsible ways of using it. And I'll come back to this quote. I just love it because it's so different in the beginning and in the end, when you're kind of like aligned with Victor Frankenstein, and then in the end, when everything has just become way more complicated. He writes, "None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder." There's always room for growth, right? For learning, for more compassion. How do we apply that to every new challenge, technological or otherwise, that we encounter? And I guess I'll leave you with that. Don't stop at age 8, right? Keep your thinking going, to echo Dr. Lavette Collier. The liberating arts will help us with that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hasselback. And I hope that encouraged you all too to check out this novel if you haven't read it already, especially if you like Gothic horror. Okay, our last presenter, Professor Makela, I'm going to pass the mic to you, and then we'll have our moment of Q&A. So get your comments and notes ready for the very end.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Amanda Makela, and let me just try and share my slides here before we get started. Okay, can everybody see that all right? Okay, great. So like I said, my name is Amanda. I am with Copley Library. My title is the Digital Initiatives Librarian, and I'm an associate professor here. And I'm going to be talking today about AI, authorship, and originality in the digital age. And my talk is kind of situated within librarianship in the fact that a lot of what academics, librarians do is they work with students and faculty, and they work with people on thinking about information. We ask people to think about evaluating sources and thinking critically about the information that they come across and the information that they consume, throughout the college experience. So that's kind of like the lens that I'm coming from. We call it in the library world, we call it information literacy, or you might also hear the word information fluency. So that's part of what I do. And as digital initiatives librarian, I also work with a lot of digital objects and digital texts. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so in today's digital landscape, I would say that, especially with the emergence of AI, we see that the lines between authorship and originality and AI, they're increasingly blurred. And especially as these AI technologies advance, they're calling into question some of the traditional notions about authorship and creativity that we've taken for granted for a long time. And we've had sort of an idea of what authorship is, and now a lot of that is being challenged in a way. So a lot of questions are coming up. Okay, so the first question we're going to think about a little bit today is simply who or what is an author? What defines an author? What makes someone an author? You know, originally you think of an author as somebody who writes something, somebody who creates something. But now we have to ask, if someone creates something or they write something using AI, who is really the author? Is it a person? Is it the AI? Is it a combination? And then this is also tied in with like ownership, the question of ownership or the question of copyright. Because up until now, you know, it's mostly the idea that copyright comes with the act of creation. So when someone takes a picture of something or they write something, they own the copyright to it. They don't even have to do anything to like register. I mean, you can register your copyright, but you don't have to. You just have to make the case or show evidence that you were the original creator and you therefore own the copyright. But what happens when AI comes onto the scene? Well, it's something that we have to think about. Say that as we use AI, and we'll come back to the copyright in a second, but as we use AI and as it becomes part of our workflow for creation, it really moves us towards a new understanding of authorship. So on the left side, you can see some authorship and being a creator that have kind of long existed culturally, societally. There's kind of been this idea throughout history that almost like it's like there's some kind of like purity, or like sometimes we'll think about, oh, it's someone, they're inspired, they're creative, they're a genius, you know, they have these ideas, they're creating, they're the author. It's also this idea that like each creation is completely original and it's new and it's its own thing, basically. And this idea of authorship makes it easy to classify or identify the author as a sole entity, a certain person, for example. It's sort of an individualistic mindset. Now we are moving toward, or I would say AI is pushing us in the direction of sort of a new understanding of authorship, where we're seeing more nuance in authorship and creation. There has to be more of an acknowledgement that authorship is a product of influence, a product of personal experience, collaboration, community, that we're building things together, right? And each new creation is still on the shoulders of what has come before it. It's a remix, it's a hybrid, it's a reaction. It takes things that have previously existed and it kind of builds on them and makes things new, but it's not created in a vacuum, right? And this can be sort of like difficult to pinpoint where the author starts and stops, which is, you know, has to do with that whole copyright question. It's just more of an understanding of like communal authorship, I would say, than some of the more individualistic ideas of the past. So there's sort of a spectrum, and in each person's view, it might fall a little different on the spectrum. Different communities or societies might define it a little differently, but I feel like overall AI is moving us a little bit more towards the right side. To circle back to this question about ownership and about copyright, so I've seen different things. I've heard that in the beginning of ChatGPT, they were saying that if someone uses ChatGPT to create something, that person owns the copyright. But now it's kind of in flux. We're seeing sort of different answers to this question. So this is what I asked ChatGPT. I just wrote, does a person own the copyright to something they create with ChatGPT? This is what they said. The copyright to content created by ChatGPT belongs to OpenAI, the company that developed it. OpenAI holds the rights to the model, the code, and the information it produces, but the situation is nuanced. Okay. So while AI generated content can be protected by copyright, the original sources of answers used by ChatGPT can be challenging to trace, because sometimes ChatGPT will just spit out a bunch of information and you don't even know exactly where it's coming from. And so as for who can claim copyright to the AI generated content, it's an evolving area. In other words, not clear answers yet. Certainly copyright law applies to human created content, which we knew that already, but they're still navigating the complexities of AI. It's this ever evolving area, and it'll be very interesting to see how it changes over time. So it's not really clear cut at this point, and it looks like, from what I've read, there's actually questions like this that are right now going through the court system, and things are being challenged, and we're going to see what kind of legal precedent comes out of this. Okay, so now I thought we could do a little activity. It would be interesting for me to see, and it's very hard for me to see like people's emoticons. So I'm going to ask you all to look at these two different examples. The example on the left, the example on the right, these are two poems. And I would like you all to just take a look at these poems, read a little bit of these poems, and then you can put your hand up. We'll say, which one of these do you think is AI created? So I'll give a few minutes here. So I think we'll try raise your hand, your emoticon, if you think that the AI is the one on the left. All right, I'm seeing maybe a third of people. It's rough, it's hard to calculate, but it's looking maybe maybe a third. I'd say a third are saying it's the one on the left. Okay, so I'm going to assume those of you who didn't raise your hand, you're going to say it's the one on the right. If anybody wants to speak and say why you think it's the one on the left or why you think it's the one on the right, let's have a comment or two. Okay, everybody's shy. That's okay. Okay, so let me go back to see if I can go back to my screen. Okay, so actually the one on the left is AI. So if you thought this was AI, very sharp, good job. The one on the right is a poem by E. Cummings in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so good job on this. Let's look at another example. These are two images. And this time I'll ask you again, raise your hand if you think it's the AI generated image is the one on the left. Right. It looks like this time fewer people are saying it's the one on the left. Yeah, it looks like most people are saying that it's not the one on the AI is not the one on the left. And to you people, the people who say the one on the left is AI, it's not AI. The one on the left is by Maynard Dixon called Home of the Desert Rat from 1945. The one on the right is AI. This one for me was a little easier because I feel like I've looked at enough AI images that I can kind of start to tell it. They usually have sort of a look about them. But if anyone else wants to chime in and respond, let me know.
There are some comments in the chat from students.
Oh, there's comments in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta scroll down here. AI images are so bad at hands. AI always has those shadows. Somebody noticed this. The left one isn't square like the Mid-Journey one usually is. Okay, so that was a telltale sign. The left one looks like a painting. It's correct. The right one looks more like AI. Okay, great. AI is usually more vibrant. AI looks cartoonish, more dreamlike, fantastical, not realistic. Yes, I would agree with all of those comments. Okay, great. So the next slide, I don't think we're going to have time for, we'll just move quickly because we're running short, but these are actually two abstracts, like for a research paper that I compared. And you can look at these. I'll just tell you right away. The one on the left is an AI generated abstract, and the one on the right is actually from a student paper, an undergraduate honors thesis that a student wrote here at USD, and they put it into our repository. So I just wanted to show that example too. Okay, so the next question we're going to move to is, what does the concept of originality, because originality is so often tied up with our understanding of authors. What does the concept of originality mean in a world where AI can generate endless variations of content? Does true originality exist, or are things just a remix or reaction, a copy or a new iteration of something that's already out there? So I don't know if anybody has seen, there's a special on Netflix by the comedian Bo Burnham, and it's an excellent special, highly recommend. He released it during the pandemic, but there was a part of his special that really captures this idea of things being reactions of new content being reaction to reaction to reaction. So I am going to try and play this clip for y'all right now.
I don't think the sound is working on our end. Yeah.
Okay, hold on one second. No sound.
I think it's a setting under share screen. When you share your screen, you have to click.
Advanced sharing options.
Yeah, I think you have to end the share
Okay.
and reinitiate the share.
Okay,
And there should be an option that says like optimize for video and audio. There should be two boxes you can click.
okay. Let's try this. Share sound. Yes. Okay. I think this is going to work. Okay, here we go. Let's try it again.
So we're not hearing any of this, right?
You don't hear anything?
No,
Oh.
I think you have to end the share and reinitiate it.
Well, you can sort of, I think we better just move on. Sorry about that. I thought you could hear it. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, you can see that basically what he was doing was he did a reaction video to a song he created. Then he did a reaction video to the reaction video, another reaction video to the reaction video it's an endless loop of a cycle, basically, of reaction. And so that's what I'm trying to talk about. But I'm sorry that the sound did not work. Let me try to get back to my slides. Okay, can you see my slideshow again? Okay, great. All right. Okay, so we're talking about authorship, we're talking about originality, we're also talking about collaborative. Remember on that spectrum that I showed you a little bit ago? And I said we're sort of moving more towards an understanding of collaborative authorship or communal authorship. And so the question kind of becomes, is there a way, how does AI serve as a catalyst for human authorship and creativity? Instead of just replacing the human author, how do we work with AI to create new things and make something that hasn't created before, but not just on our own, but with AI? Now, I don't know if anybody has heard of the term ghostwriting, but sometimes you'll see like a celebrity, for example, might write a memoir, and it's not the celebrity that actually wrote the book. They're using what they call a ghostwriter. That's someone that they hire to create the book, and they dialogue with the celebrity, but they actually do the writing. And so there are some articles, and I actually linked it in the presentation, but there's actually like some articles that have talked about how AI, like ChatGPT, for example, is similar to ghostwriting. And it's just sort of a different kind. It's not using another human, but it's using a machine in a sense. And so ghostwriting is something that's been happening for a long time. And it's in some ways rather similar to what we're seeing now with ChatGPT and some of the other tools. Okay, so how can we use AI as a catalyst? What are some ways that we can sort of work with AI? How can you leverage it? There's certain things that really right now educators recommend, especially for students who are interested in trying to utilize AI, and that is there's certain ways that are more productive to use AI than others. One good way to use AI is to help you brainstorm topics, generate ideas, generate examples, kind of at the beginning of your research stage. Have them sort of help pitch ideas. AI can pull in and synthesize large amount of information very quickly because it is scanning such a vast amount of sources. It can help you sometimes develop a guide or like a preliminary outline that you can then develop more fully. But sometimes when you're at the very beginning of a topic, you just need a little bit of that guidance. It can sometimes help you find the right word or phrase or description if there's something you're looking for and can't come up with it on your own, ask AI maybe for some synonyms, for example. And sometimes it can also even suggest improvements in like grammatical structure, or just like if you already give it something that you've written, and you can see if it's giving you recommendations for rephrasing or restructuring your sentence, that can help too. These are the kinds of things that it can help with, but there's also things that you want to sort of beware about. So you may have heard that one thing AI will do is actually, it will return sometimes fake citations. You'll ask, I'm writing about this, and can you give me some sources, some research sources? There's times when it does this business where it gives you citations that don't even exist. They're called hallucinations. And there was a case where some lawyers did a filing, and they got in big trouble because the cases and the other things that they were citing were fake. They didn't even exist. So keep that in mind. If you ever get sources from AI, go back and actually check them yourself. There's also, of course, biases that are embedded in existing sources. So the literature that the AI is pulling from, if there's biases in that pool, which there can be a lot of racial, gender biases in existing literature. AI is just going to basically recycle those. So keep that in mind. And the other thing with AI is that it's not always necessarily the most current, because it will pull from sources that are a couple of years old. So you always want to pay attention to, the latest version, for example, of ChatGPT. Does it end at 2022, or what is that cutoff date? Because you might not be getting the most current information. And so with that being said, I would just encourage everybody, when in doubt, don't rely solely on AI, right? It's very important to think of all the different resources that you have at your disposal, particularly as a student at USD. And you have wonderful research databases that the library provides. You have librarians that the library provides. And we can help with all kinds of things, from developing a research question to finding sources, evaluating sources, ordering materials. If we don't have them, we have a great system for interlibrary loan. We can provide referrals to other campus services too, if you find that there's something that you need elsewhere. And of course, we can also, if you get to the point where you want to publish your work, that's one thing that I work very closely with students on, because I work on our institutional repository. So if you get to that stage, we can help you with strategize how to publish your work. So I know that time is short. We need time for questions. So I will close it out, and thanks all for your attention.